I welcome you back to our continuing study in the Gospel of Matthew. We are continuing through our trek through the Gospel of Matthew. We are in Matthew chapter 23 and verses 13 and 14. I am going to be reading out of a New Testament, which is translated by Monsieur Knox. Matthew chapter 23 and verses 13 and 14. Woe upon you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites that shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in men's face. You will neither enter yourselves nor let others enter when they would. Woe upon you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites that swallow up the property of widows under cover of your long prayers. Your sentence will be all the heavier for that. The first thing we have to deal with this passage is that not all translations have verse 14. The verse is found in parallel accounts in Mark chapter 12 and verse 40 and Luke chapter 20 and verse 47. Now, here we have to step back and see what is going on by virtue of how the Bible is presented, formed, created, and passed on from generation to generation. And the first 1500 years, the New Testament was printed manually. That meant every copy of the New Testament was done so by a person using a writing instrument and copying it by hand. The printing press that is invented in the 15th century in what is now Germany, provides the foundation for a literate society. Since reading material now can become affordable, understand that prior to the printing press, reading material was expensive. The production of books was limited. The printing press allows for the expansion of books to be published and the cost of them to go down. That's generally a truism in our economics, that as technology advances, the cost of items tends to drop relative to time. Now, what the printing press also did is it leads to standardization. Now, if you take the English language as an example, and as a native speaker of English, that's the one I'm most familiar with, you are probably aware of the variance in the English language as you go from the American South to the Midlands in Great Britain to the Outback in Australia. We have one language, but there are variants in the language in each of these areas. Now, if you go back in time to the United Kingdom and England proper, several hundred years ago, the variants in languages were, of course, just there because English was only spoken, as it were, just there. And you would find the variations in language from region to region within England quite striking. So what the printing press would allow is standardization in terms of a published document. Now, standardization also applies to spelling. I would have been in my glory a few centuries ago, for spelling was all over the map. One of the outcomes of having a printing press is it leads to standardization of spelling. And one of the ways it does is it eventually leads to the production of modern dictionaries. And modern dictionaries set out how we are to spell words, right versus wrong. So when I pick up a copy of a modern translation of scripture, and be it that I'm in the American South or in the Midlands in England or in the Outback of Australia, like, say, the New International Version, it doesn't matter where I am in the world, I'm going to be reading a standardized text. Though my English may be at variance with other English speakers, what I read is going to be standard. The modern text cannot reflect a usage of language which is unique to that area. In the days before standardization through the printing press, the text of Scripture was not standardized. I'm using an illustration which is not completely exact, but what I am saying is if we had handwritten copies of the scripture today, the variance in language between each of these three regions, the American South, the Midlands in England, and the Outback in Australia, would be reflected in the copies of these scripture. Same language, but not standardization. Now, it's important to understand this is one of the aspects that the printing press does. The reason that verse 14 is not in many modern translations is that it was not in the important text of Matthew. So how do we come about where I can pick up my copy of a New Testament today? How does this arrive at me? Well, one of the things that happens is something called textual criticism. Now, textual criticism is that branch of biblical studies that seeks to arrive at the most accurate text of the original document. What we are saying is, as the texts were copied manually or by hand, variations enter in. It is only with the rise of the printing press in the 1400s that we can have standardization of the text. And now as these variations enter in, some are spelling, some are particular words. But in some cases, what happens is you take a case like Matthew, the person who was copying it knew what Luke recorded or what Mark included. And what often happens is there is this move to make what is here the same with what is there and there also. So when we look at verse 14 in Matthew chapter 23, what we probably have is originally a case in which this was not there. We know that because in the ancient texts that we have, the standards say it is not there. And it was brought into the text because it was in these other texts. And so the printing press allows us to standardize Matthew's text as more or less the way Matthew wrote it. In verse 13, Jesus is rebuking the teachers of the law and Pharisees. And in this case, we are not so much talking of pastoral leadership as those who shape the understanding of the faith. Now, a local pastor at times can be swimming upstream. How do they shape the beliefs and practices of a congregation that has access to books and videos on the faith? In particular, when some of the material is sub-Christian and worse. In every generation, there are leaders who use the church to their own end. The problem is that they can create followers who do not see the heresy and that which is taught. A pastor in a small, struggling church cannot always compete with the corporate reach of some of these false teachers. Jesus warns us that not all who occupy a position of leadership in Christendom are worthy of our attention.